Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Research Fellow for China and National Security at the Heritage Foundation. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com. My guest today is Weifeng Zhong. Weifeng was born in Shaoguan, China, and serves as a senior advisor for the America First Policy Institute's Office for Fiscal and Regulatory Analysis. He has over a decade of experience applying data analytics and artificial intelligence to policy questions. He's the co-creator of the Policy Change Index, an open source project that uses AI to analyze and predict government's actions based on their words. In a matter of 5 years, the PCI project grew from a two-programmer playground to a suite of software tools that have informed U.S. and allied government agencies, the private sector, and academia about the behavior of authoritarian regimes like China and Russia. Weifeng received his PhD in managerial economics and strategy at Northwestern University, and before joining AFPI was a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. With that, Weifeng, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
Well, it's a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this conversation. And as I teased before we began recording, we'd like our audience to get to know you a little bit as a person before we jump into the meat of matters. And someone who grew up in a very different society and are now in sort of the freedom hub of America, maybe share a little bit about what your origin story is, what some of your thoughts were in your formative years about what you might do when you grew up versus what you have ended up doing.
Yeah, so before I actually came to America, my first stop outside of China was actually Hong Kong. But in my mind, Hong Kong was kind of like outside of China, if
Right.
you think about it in terms of values and economic system, right? Political system to some extent. So I was born and raised in China in the early 80s. So growing up, well, it was a very rapidly changing environment economically in the mainland. I remember, so when I was an infant, there was not really milk available to anyone. So I grew up eating like mushy rice, like ground rice powder, and then made into some mushy stuff. Not much nutrition, but I guess I turned out okay. But I remember very distinctively, like growing up in China, very soon after, maybe when I was a few years old, I was able to have some, meat because stuff was becoming available.
Now, were you living more in a city area or more in a countryside environment?
In the city area.
Yeah.
Good point, Steve. Because in the coastal area, it changes. It changed more rapidly than in the rural area. So by the time I left China, that was 2006. The Chinese economy was already huge. But my first stop was actually Hong Kong, which is halfway between freedom and China.
Yeah.
It was a eye-opening experience to me, and it made me want to have more freedom because freedom in Hong Kong was kind of limited. And it took me until actually coming to the U.S. to realize freedom in the U.S. in America was kind of limited too, which is why we need to keep fighting. But that was sort of my life journey coming out from China.
Well, in terms of academic or professional training, what kind of lane were you running in as you progressed through your education? Were you steered more in the direction of hard sciences? Did you think you were going to go more into academic or practical applications as you were progressing?
Well, I didn't really have much idea, even when I was going to college in China. All I knew was I wanted to get out of there. And so Hong Kong was feasible in where, from where I was. I wasn't able to go into like a top university in China. But I was able to get to Hong Kong, the University of Hong Kong, which is the oldest university on the island. I remember I really started to figure out what I wanted to do for my life when I arrived in Hong Kong. I was walking on the campus at the university. One of the very first thing I saw was what I thought was an eyesore. It's a bloody red sculpture,
Mhm.
a few story high, um, pointing out, it's all like red bodies piling up in the middle of the square and on the at the university. So I stepped close. I was like, "What is this doing in the middle of the campus?" It says Tiananmen Square massacre. So I was like, "What the heck are you talking about? There's nobody died in Tiananmen Square." And that's when I realized how much of a lie I was living in China. Because growing up at school, we learned about what they call the disturbance on the Tiananmen Square. Everything was fine because the government took care of it. So it was only after I got to Hong Kong, saw that shocking sculpture, and made me want to go to the library. I started to read all the books I could find about Tiananmen Square massacre. I watched footage back in at the time about soldiers just shooting innocent citizens and students in Tiananmen Square. It was heartbroken to me, um, and it also made me realize, I had a great opportunity now because now I'm outside of China. That's what I thought when I was in Hong Kong. I used to be like a puppet being manipulated by the communist system, but now I'm outside. It's like I'm sitting in the audience and watching the puppet show because I'm no longer in the mainland. And so
Yeah.
that gave me the idea from that point on to say, well, since we are able to watch China, let's just watch the regime, watch the puppeteer, watch what it's doing. And so it turns out that if you just watch very closely, you could actually tell what the Chinese Communist Party is looking to do, because they oftentimes just gave it away very openly in the propaganda machine.
Well, that's a really important area that we want to have as the meat of our conversation. But before we jump ahead, and we're going to stick with a few appetizers in our meal at this point, I would really be curious to hear what drove you to seek to get out. I mean, going from the PRC proper into Hong Kong at that time is still within the PRC, but definitely, as you were alluding, these are different worlds in 2006. Was it just the opportunity to go to university? When you went to go to university, did you think I may never come back? Or did you think, hey, I'm just going there because this is the best opportunity for me right now? And it wasn't until you sort of were mugged by seeing the memorial to the martyrs that you thought, ooh, I don't know whether I'm going to go back there.
It was actually 2002 when I went to college. That was the beginning, in my eye, of China starting to close up. It was the beginning of the internet era. College kids, they used to go on BBS and the bulletin board systems, but it's not for their own universities. I was able to actually go on the BBS of Peking University, Tsinghua University, but only in the year 2002, because starting in 2003, the former Chinese president Hu Jintao started to realize, oh, actually, freedom of speech is a problem to the CCP. So they started to crack down. So I was no longer able to see, even though I saw in the first year of my college, I was no longer able to see what kids at Tsinghua University were talking about.
Mhm.
And so it made me realize there must be something there. Like I couldn't even see what the rest of China was talking about. I wanted to see what the rest of the world is talking about. I know we were being censored when we search for some terms. The search engine Baidu would just not turn up anything. If you look for Taiwan, for example, you were not able to find anything. So I knew that there's unknown, but the unknowns were unknown.
Aha. That's a nice allusion to the former Secretary of Defense, Don Rumsfeld, and his knowns and unknowns. But so you go from being censored in China, you had some awareness of being censored, but you didn't have awareness of just how much. You go to Hong Kong, your area of vision expands, and you're starting to get a sense of here are some of the key topics I had no idea about. You're seeing footage. As you were sort of watching the video images of news coverage of 1989, what were some of the thoughts that were going through your head? Because you had gone through a system where this is literally erased. And it's kind of unfathomable for a lot of people outside of China to imagine how can something that was so widely covered in the global media effectively be blocked from a billion plus people? So maybe share a little bit of your unique view on coming out of the allegory of the cave in darkness and into some parts of the light. And what did you start thinking about in terms of your experience before?
Yeah, so what was most shocking to me was my hometown was in Guangdong, which is really just a few hours from Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you know people in Hong Kong had been, until maybe a few years ago, doing the candlelight vigil on
Yes.
right in Victoria Square to pay tribute to the people who were killed every year on June 4th. I grew up practically 3 hours from Hong Kong.
Yeah.
For 17 years in China, I had no idea people were gathering to do that, something so huge all over the TV. It's like people in Pennsylvania doing something every year that we live in DC and had no idea about. It's unbelievable. So the lesson to me was, so the people from China, they reacted differently to realizing the truth of Tiananmen Square massacre. Some would say, oh, uh, some would say, oh yeah, the CCP is bad, and they kind of stop there. To me, the revelation is more about information. It's how powerful propaganda was, and so then I thought, if I were the CCP, if I had such a powerful machine to control people's thought, I would choose my words very carefully in the print, right, in the press. And so for us now, as part of the audience, we should watch the words very intently and try to make inferences about the thinking process behind those words.
Well, for sure. So after you had sort of the shroud taken off of your eyes with Tiananmen Square, what other areas you say? Well, if they had engaged in effective information warfare about this, what else have I been misled about? And if I was misled and I'm Chinese, how has the rest of the world been misled by these processes? What were the other sort of policy, political, or other development issues that you went to after realizing what happened with Tiananmen Square?
Well, so I started to learn more about China when I was actually outside of China.
Yeah,
I started to read much more on Chinese history than I used to in China, because I wanted to basically relitigate everything I was taught in school. So that
yeah.
was like a years long process. I enjoyed it very much. So I did that in Hong Kong. I did that when I was at Northwestern. When I came to the U.S., I studied economics, but I still try to read up on Chinese history, Chinese politics. Great scholars, many great China scholars are in the U.S. actually, right? Not necessarily in China. You actually need to leave China to understand China better. But the flip side was also, I think there's also some misconception about how the Chinese system works in the U.S. And so it's fascinating area to be in, to be between, to interpret, how China looks at the U.S. or the West, and how people in the West look into China.
Well, for sure. Maybe you can help us get a little bit of perspective on how China's censorship compares with the challenges or debates that we have about free speech in the United States, the West generally, or just in modern societies around the world. What's different about the China approach and the sort of tug of war that we have right now?
I think there's actually not much different. They're actually not that different. Now, so censorship in China was such that if you say something wrong, you go to jail, right? Yeah, so it's not that bad compared to, if you compare the U.S. to China. But I think a lot of censorship actually happened at the self-censorship level.
Yeah.
Like in China, people are very careful about what they say on the internet, even among friends. Not necessarily that if they said something, they would be put in jail immediately. It's just that they didn't want to get into the trouble, right? And so I think people actually stop way before they will actually get into any practical trouble. Practical troubles. They already choose their words very carefully and not say things that they really think. And I think we are basically in that sense, I think we have just about, we have still a very severe level of self-censorship in this country. I have met professors at university who are conservative, but they just didn't want to speak their minds because they didn't want to get into trouble with the university. Especially universities now are much more tight in terms of political correctness compared to in the past. I've known a lot of professors who European professors who came to the U.S. in the 90s. They thought they were in the middle of the road at the time, and now they never really changed because I knew them, but now they appear to be a far right conservative. It's because the entire political spectrum in the U.S. has moved so far to the left, and people who were in the middle of the road, they were starting to censor themselves, self-censor.
Well, I've often just seen this as cultural Marxism. There are a lot of the building blocks of the Cultural Revolution that I see dusted off and modernized and weaponized with technology, but the net effects are the same. You have the nosy nanny on the corner that is watching what other people are doing. Gossip and social approval or disapproval are really powerful in neighborhoods, whether online, professional, or physical neighborhoods. And it just seems to me, when we're looking at self censorship, the sort of cultural weaponization of tech, and political weaponization of tech in recent years, a lot of this is just echoes of what the Cultural Revolution was, in my view, or just cultural Marxism. That's me being raised in the West and having butted heads with some things inside of China from time to time. Does that ring true to you, or do you see it any differently?
Absolutely, I think you're absolutely right, Steve. The what we So when I was in Hong Kong, another story we could talk about was so I read a book about a biography of the founder of the Tibetan Communist Party,
Mm-hmm.
which is not the same as the Tibetan portion of the Chinese Communist Party. It was so Tibet was actually kind of like a separate country for a while. Um, the so there's some what CCP would consider sensitive content in the biography. It's written in English, published by the University of Hong Kong. I wrote a piece that's in Chinese that's half translation, half commentary. I post that article online, and I watched my article to be censored in real time because I was monitoring the website. It was heartbreaking to see a process like this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in Hong Kong, I did that deliberately as an experiment just to see how far I would go. In China, people just didn't do it at all, right? But in a very like the American environment you described, Steve, sometimes people also choose to not post content for the same reason, right? What difference is really there between you preventing yourself to talk versus the government preventing you to talk from talking, right? It's not one of they're one of the same. So I think that what we need to realize is that um, free speech environment in America has been narrowing for years.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same in China. What people have overlooked is that China was doing economically, politically, was doing much better in the 80s and 90s when China was trying to be more open. And there are a lot of people in this country who are no longer trying to be more open,
Yeah.
to fight for freedom, which is a very unfortunate trend that we really need to revert.
Well, hopefully that counsel will reverberate with the audience and the people our audience talks to, because it's awfully important. And really, I think you ring a bell that resonates with me in what we saw happening in China in the 1980s and much of the 90s. There obviously were problems still. There was a massive crackdown in Tibet. There were problems with crackdowns on religious freedom. There was the Tiananmen Square massacre, which was not only in Beijing, but was in other parts of China. And even in the West, we didn't have very much coverage of that. So I'm not to say that it was all sunshine and rainbows and unicorns in the 80s and 90s, but there was a lot of hope at that time. Even the great anti-communist warrior Ronald Reagan went to China. Deng Xiaoping knew how to play to the audience and say the right words. There were people taking risks in trying to develop economically and open up and start building things in China in ways that hadn't happened before. I remember traveling in the countryside in the 90s, and people would very directly talk about their interest in Christianity, their lack of interest in things Taiwan. They cared a lot more about a bridge or a hospital or a school in their township than they did Taiwan. They would bluntly tell me, if the people of Taiwan don't want to be a part of us, what does that have to do with me? And that was widespread in the China countryside of the 90s. All's to say, because people did have the latitude to think and act in ways that really were very material about development where they were. I'm sure that there was censorship when I met with people in the countryside. The state security people, public security people would visit those villages afterwards and ask, what did the white guy talk about? What did you tell the white guy? So it wasn't freedom. I was not under the illusion it was complete freedom, but it was a far cry from where things are now. So I think it's a really interesting thing to warn people that China started really changing that direction early, and even Hu Jintao began shifting somewhat. But it's really the empowering technology of the internet that we thought would be liberating, that early in that experience, the Chinese Communist Party recognized, well, this needs to be controlled too. And so it wasn't Xi Jinping that started doing that. It was earlier that started happening, if I'm listening to you correctly.
Absolutely. I think there's a similar misconception in the West in parallel to this fantasy about internet. Was in the US, we had this fantasy about engagement with China in the hope that China would become a more open society. In the early 2000s, when China just joined the WTO, we were thinking, China would be part of the economic system, would become a normal country. But what ended up happening was that international organizations like the WTO, like the World Bank, like all these World Health Organizations, all these institutions are being corrupted and being manipulated by China's malicious intent over the years. They joined with the purpose of changing the rules to serve their purposes, while all the while we were hoping that they would actually become better.
Right.
I think that's a grave misconception that we had for many years.
Well, couldn't agree more. And that's been a topic with many, many of our guests. The bet that was made that by integrating China into all these globalist institutions, that China would adapt to the rules and norms of those institutions. But what has played out over time, whether it's World Trade, World Health, even the UN Security Council, Human Rights Commission, whatever it may be, those entities were bent to comply with China's interests more than China adapted to comport with those entities. And I just think we've seen that over and over and over if people are willing to see. So the challenge now is, where do we go? But with the particular focus on free speech and human rights, I'd like to get your take on what you think U.S. policymakers most need to understand about China's information control efforts, because I've always tried to put forward the thesis that is straight out of Marxism, Leninism, that if you control the words, you control the thoughts, you control the thoughts, you control the actions, you control the actions, you control the policies and outcomes. And so for them, information and war of words is actually the starting point for having control. And so if I'm right about that, then we should be very, very sober about the realities of trying to engage Beijing on anything that touches upon free expression. But yet, this is a very, very important issue in the field of technology. We are getting into artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is a new foundation for a lot of things that are central in our way of life. And so, what would be sort of your counsel about what policymakers should be thinking about, and maybe a policy or two they should be contemplating as we navigate this?
Well, I think we kind of have had this lesson in the era of internet, like before the era of AI. And I'm not sure that Americans have learned that lesson very well, which is that in the engagement with China in the internet era, we have a lot of Western institutions that are incrementally influenced by Chinese narratives. If you just pick all these major newspapers, right? They have China has spread content in Western news outlets, major news outlets, for many years now. Sometimes they would do it in tricky ways. They used to put full page image advertisement on
Yeah.
major newspapers like Washington Post, Washington Journal. They have that all the time. They look just like another page from taken out of a Chinese newspaper, except that it was supposed to be an advertisement as an image to stick on the entire page, right? And all these Western institutions, they took Chinese money, advertising money, sure, Chinese money. A lot of people like that, and it is because of these kind of commercial interests that has created a room for China to sort of influence the Western mindset. We're increasingly more accustomed to the Chinese narrative about need to control, need to have order, need to have engagement with China. And so I think this is now we're really realizing that, but maybe a little bit too late. Now, when it comes to the age of AI, I think that's another battle that was just started. If you think about large language models, you have the Western large language models, but the Chinese have their own too. Like the DeepSeek was a pretty news-breaking example. But if you look at their models, might be really fast. Their models might be able to compose Chinese literature, out
Yeah.
of the chatbot. That's better than what American models can. But um, content on Chinese AI models are highly censored as well. And we didn't realize that. So if you use AI models provided by China, your mindset, just like in the consuming news, will be entirely shaped by the Chinese narrative. So what we need to do is to not only to win this AI race with China, to have our AI technology to be more advanced, to dominate the Chinese versions, but also have our American AI technology to be freedom of speech preserving, so to speak. Right? You have all these content moderation going on right now with not only with AI models, but also with social media content. I think we need to radically pursue freedom instead of radically pursuing self-censorship.
Well, amen to that. And I hope that we are, in fact, at the beginning of a golden age that is pushing for an American strategic victory on this front, not just for ourselves, although that's fine with me, but also bringing along like minded, true responsible stakeholders in the international system. I mean, this is an area where we should have common cause with Japan, Korea, several of the European leading nations in this area of tech. And we should be able to, in aggregate, do so much more than China with its controlled and censored models are able to reach. But today there seems to be almost a sense of fear or pessimism on the side of the West. and maybe irrational overexuberance on the side of China, and maybe almost some fatalism among some observers in the West that they're just on this trajectory and they're inevitably going to overtake us. What do you say about how you look at this intersection of technology, speech, and freedom, and what it means for our real ability to compete, and maybe some limits on what China's real ability to compete might be?
Yeah, I think we need to be more optimistic about the future of America. If you think about China, so the interesting thing is the lack of freedom in China, in the speech environment and elsewhere, it's a limiting factor to economic growth. But we don't see that right away. China, in terms of a speech environment, started to tide up in the late 90s, I would say, but more so in the 2000s. The economic slowdown happened, several years down the road. And so what we are seeing now is, I think, it's the remnant of China's economic growth when it was more free back then. But we are already seeing a lot of signs of decline in the Chinese economy. Just look at how even just after the lifting the lockdown of the COVID era lockdown, China's economy was actually worse than before COVID. Not to say not having any bounce back. But if you look at the U.S. and the Western society, where we are not so uptight about locking everybody down, we are bouncing back much better. Right? So I think we need to be more optimistic. We need to realize that China's economic problems now is because of their political problems years before. And so we should not just look at China to say, oh, they're not free, but they have a lot of money, so we probably can do fine with control.
Mhm.
It's the opposite. They are struggling now precisely because the room of freedom is narrowing increasingly in the last 2 decades. And so the lesson Americans should learn is that right now the country seems to be doing fine, but economically. But if you think about the speech environment, if you think about all these self-censorship that we have in our political system and the tribalism, what we need to know is that we need to actually change that. Otherwise, it will start eventually to be a drag of our economic growth.
Well, I think that's an important message, and it sort of anticipated what my next question was going to be, because we're observing a free speech week, and I wanted to tee you up to see what kind of a message you would want to give to our audience that is focused really on the value of a free speech week.
I think we should take it to heart that freedom in America was not a given. It's something we need to fight for. Millions, billions of people, actually billions of people in China, in India, and the rest of the world have fought so hard for it, and they still couldn't quite get it. We were fortunate enough in America to used to have a lot of it. We're having a little bit less. It's a lesson. It's a warning call that we need to, a wake up call that we need to go back to fighting for it. We need to continue to fight for expand our freedom, not only in speech environment, but I think also in the look around in the economy. Businesses are restricted by government in so many other ways, and that regulatory burden on the economy and the high tax burden on the economy is dragging the economic growth for our day-to-day life and for the American people. So we need to enter this golden age of fighting for freedom, not only in economic way, but also in political ways.
As we think about advocates for free speech in the US and elsewhere, what can they do to help preserve or uncover suppressed voices elsewhere? I mean, I agree with you that we need to be fighting for it here, because if it's lost here, where else will it be saved? But as we have and exercise this freedom, what can we and should we be doing to preserve and uncover suppressed voices elsewhere, maybe in particular in China?
Well, China has this great firewall on the internet. It's going to be very hard to break. There are people who are uh, more technically skillful in mainland who would try to jump the firewall to see the content outside that's censored from inside China. But content in general in the Western world is very hard to get into China. But there are some rare occasions where Chinese voices and the Western world sort of interact. I think for a brief period there was this. To use an interesting example, for a brief period there was this app called Clubhouse, where people will hop on and chat without any transcript. Right, it's totally spontaneous and also supposed to be very secure. And for a brief while, the residents in China were able to hop on and talk to other people around the world. And I saw an episode, a conversation in the clubhouse room, where a mainland Chinese resident was talking to a Uyghur resident who was discussing about all the human rights abuse in the Xinjiang area. And so it was very shocking to the mainlander because that person had no idea. Just like I had no idea about Tiananmen Square, that person had no idea about all the labor camps in Xinjiang. And of course, that app was very quickly censored in China. But I think for to the extent that we could make a difference, I think creating venues where free exchange could happen, even however briefly that is, I think would be at least some help on the margin. But we also need to have more transparency in terms of Chinese influence around the world. We need to realize when we see content propagated by Chinese propaganda machine, we need to know about it, and we need to avoid it. Otherwise, the rest of the world will be increasingly influenced by Chinese narratives.
Well, and as you experienced personally, and we acknowledge the risks you took and celebrate your march toward freedom and where you are now in helping us fight for freedom in America. This is one of those long battles that we have to make sure that our leaders remain engaged in the right ways, that they see the information control and manipulation for what it is. And it has shocked me over the decades how permissive the West has been to manipulation by this Chinese Communist Party, and how successful the Chinese Communist Party has been in isolating the people of China from any even weak effort by the West to inform, much less manipulate, the people of China. I think that we had a much freer hand in the 80s and 90s in doing that, and maybe we didn't even do it well enough then. But today it seems like I wonder whether we even try hard enough to balance the scales, because the West should have the upper hand in setting narratives and moving information, and trying to get information to the people inside China, so that you are not alone, and I don't think you are alone, in seeing the memorial to the martyrs and starting to think differently and challenging the narratives of history. And just to punctuate that as we move to a close, I have a question for you to see whether you agree with me. And there's no right or wrong answer. I've had people debate both sides of this. But I am very, very strongly of the view that the Communist Party engaged in a revolution against all of China's past, that it sought to destroy all of the institutions of traditional China, not just the Qing Empire, not just the Republican era, but all of the institutions of China's past. Language, the family, religion, Confucianisms, whatever that may have been. And so when it established the People's Republic of China and announced Xinhua, New China, it meant it. It was a break from the old. It was establishing a new China. And so for me, when people talk about centuries and millennia of China, I do not apply that to the People's Republic of China, because they conducted a revolution. They chose to throw that away. However, there are a lot of people say, no, if you want to understand the nature of China today and where it's going in the future, you have to see the movement of thousands of years of history, this deep culture, thinking in century segments of time versus sort of the immediate and transactional kinds of things. So with that backdrop, where would you fall on this divide of, was 1949 a complete break with the past and new China is a relatively young culture and country? And how much of it really should be, nope, the Chinese people, despite their government, have this deep culture and tradition, and we need to think of these thousands of years and deep culture when trying to engage China's government and people successfully today?
Well, I used to think more of in the latter direction, that China has a long history. To understand China from a Western perspective, you need to understand the Chinese history. Not so much with President Xi now,
Yeah.
because what he stood out to me was he's a very unique Chinese leader who doesn't really know too much. If you think about Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, right, Hu Jintao, all of them were very well, dictators as they were. They were very well read. They knew a lot about Chinese history. Mao Zedong was a prime example. Xi Jinping only had like a elementary school, I think, education. And he tried a little bit. He didn't try too hard. He didn't learn too much. I think his father was a privileged member of the Communist Party, at least for a time, and that he basically wasn't quite uneducated. I think he has very little burden from breaking away with the Chinese tradition. Just look at all the people around him.
Yeah.
People around him now in the Chinese elitist class were not that educated either. When you don't know that much, you just do whatever you want. And I think that's very bad for not only for the rest of the world, it's actually very bad for the Chinese people, and also very bad for themselves, because I'm not sure they know what they were doing. Which is, I think it presents an example to people in China. They used to look up to their leadership in Beijing, at least as censored as they are. They're used to looking up to Beijing. I think that presents a unique opportunity for us in the US to provide a good example to the Chinese people about what freedom really is, because they could no longer. We have lost Hong Kong as an example. The bloody red sculpture I mentioned at the very beginning of the episode was already taken down by, again, self-censorship. So Hong Kong was no longer an example of freedom to the Chinese people. Now the US need to step up. We need to show the Chinese people and the rest of the world what a fight for freedom or free speech environment really is. I think we are starting to lose a little bit of it, and we need to take that back.
Well, I couldn't agree more with that. And I think that's a wonderful spot to punctuate our conversation and offer you, Weifeng, for people in the audience that want to follow your thoughts and your commentary or any of your published works. Where should they go to get the deep thoughts and wisdom of Weifeng Zhong?
Oh, thank you, Steve, for saying that. So I have done a propaganda analysis project along the line of what we talked about. It's called a Policy Change Index. Mm-hmm. So the easiest way to learn about that is to go to policychangeindex.org. And of course, I work at the America First Policy Institute, so you can also find my work at the americafirstpolicy.com.
Excellent. Well, for our audience, if you enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing, and visit ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you very much for joining, and a special thank you to Weifeng Zhong for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.